Noom, the sponsor for today's episode. Grubhub! Yeah, they sponsored us. If you've been following the Food Theory channel for over the past few months, then you know why this is such a big deal. The sponsor for today's episode, Bright Sellers. You know who has a slogan that isn't full of lies? Our sponsor for today's episode, Noom. Using Honey, our sponsor for today's episode, to save money on all your online purchases probably will, because nothing is sexier than saving money. HelloFresh, the sponsor of today's episode. To thank NordVPN, the sponsor of today's episode, for not only supporting the channel, but for also making this episode physically possible. Our sponsor for today's episode, Bright Sellers. Our sponsor for today's episode, Noom. Steph and I have been using the health program Noom for a couple months now, with the help of our sponsor for today's episode, HelloFresh. The sponsor of today's episode, Fetch, and their savvy approach to advertising, Food Theory end cards. Thanks to Traeger, the sponsor for today's episode. Sure, it does burgers, but this is a serious grill that is way more versatile than that. Huge thank you to our sponsor of today's episode, HelloFresh. The sponsor for today's episode, Bright Sellers, the monthly wine subscription that uses a 7-question non-wine snobby quiz to match you to the perfect wine based on your unique tastes. Sponsor for today's episode, Skillshare. Our sponsor for today's episode, Skillshare, an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes. Audible, the sponsor for today's episode. Our sponsor for today's episode, Skillshare, an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people just like yourself. But do you know what looks good for the future of learning? Skillshare, our sponsor for today's episode. However, what we can enjoy is a delicious meal from the sponsor of today's episode, HelloFresh. Sponsor for today's episode, Fetch. Fetch Rewards is a super easy to use free app where you earn rewards on literally anything you buy. I use and am super grateful to today's sponsor, Ritual Vitamins. Huge thank you to the sponsor of today's episode, HelloFresh, who sends recipes and meal kits to your doorstep each and every week.
Hey guys, I think I got every single one where Food Theory is sponsored, but if I didn't, let me know in the comments down below.